Hi everyone, welcome back to Platform Strategies. So this is lecture 1B. We're talking about what are platforms and why, basically an overview. So there are some discussion questions that we want to provide you this chance to think about our issues. Okay, so typically this kind of discussion questions is going to help you understand more about the materials. So let's take a look. So whenever you get the idea about what do we mean by multi-sided platforms, it's worthwhile to go through several big brands so that you think about their functions and consider and ask yourself whether they do any business in a platform manner. All right? So here we do have several brands, for example, Apple, Google, Microsoft, blah, blah, blah. So for each of the brand, I'm going to now go through some of their functions and to discuss with you about whether that's a platform business or not. So of course, there are always many other companies doing all kinds of things. I'm not going to be able to list all of them, but I'm just going to list some major things that are important and some things that some students typically get confused with. Okay, so let's start. So Apple. Apple does a lot of things. For example, we mentioned about app stores, okay? So for that app store, obviously Apple is doing a platform business. Apple is selling smartphones. Apple is creating some apps on smartphones. In fact, if Apple wants, Apple can say, okay, if you are using iPhone, you may use only apps created by Apple. All right, Apple can do that. Consider Google Map, for example. Apple also has its map application, but Apple still allow everybody to use Google Map. All right, so Apple is creating this app store as a platform business to allow and welcome third parties. So why is that? Because Apple wants a lot of apps so that it attracts consumers. All right, so that's something. Very quickly, many people may think about iTunes. All right, so on iTunes, the major product, at least for many years, is MP3. So traditionally, we buy music by purchasing albums in CDs, and Apple iTunes is one of the major players that sells MP3 per song. So that each song you may purchase that in US $1 or $0.5, something like that. Okay, so you may think about iTunes and consider whether iTunes is a multi-sided platform or not. And you may say, okay, iTunes seems to be a multi-sided platform because we have consumers and we have several studios. We have artists and they get connected together onto iTunes Store so that it is a multi-sided platform. Well, if you're thinking that way, my opinion is that let's think about it again. So this is iTunes Store, all right? And in most cases, iTunes Store or Apple, they talk to studios, try to purchase authorization of selling MP3. Maybe in some fixed fee, maybe in some revenue sharing. And then once iTunes or Apple gets the authorization, they set up the price by themselves for each song and then sell to consumers. When consumers buy anything from iTunes, consumer make a business with Apple instead of with Sony, AVX, Warner Music, blah blah blah. Okay, so in my opinion, they don't do transactions with each other. No, Apple purchase authorization and then make their own pricing decision to sell to consumers. In my opinion, iTunes Store is done in a merchant way instead of multi-sided platforms. Okay, so if you also agree with me, then your very natural question is that, well, why is that happens? Apple is making an app business as a multi-sided platforms, right? But for MP3, Apple thinks it's a different way. It's going to use a traditional merchant decision. So there must be some reasons, and that's going to be one of the case that we should talk about in lecture 2. Okay, but hopefully we now agree that for iTunes Store is a merchant model instead of a multi-sided platform. Okay, so that's about Apple, something we should be aware of. Google. So Google Search obviously is a multi-sided platform because as consumers, we don't pay anything. And there are advertisers, they pay for us. As we mentioned, that's cross-subsidization. Google does not need to do that. Google can still say, okay, I'm just going to sell the service by myself. But Google believes this is not the best option, best strategy. So that will be one example when we talk about pricing, talk about subsidization, cross-subsidization. Google obviously does a lot of different things. For example, maybe you may think about one example as Google Maps. When you look at Google Maps, it's interesting because on Google Maps, actually there are a lot of information not provided by Google. For example, if today as a consumer you go to search on Google Maps, you're going to see that there are a lot of restaurants, and these restaurants provide their information onto Google Maps. What's even more interesting is that maybe some restaurants, they don't provide information by themselves. And you may see that there are restaurants with a lot of photos, reviews, blah, blah, blah. Those photos and reviews are provided by consumers, right? So basically, Google Maps says that, okay, I'm going to create a place, a multi-sided platforms, and welcome everybody to contribute contents onto Google Maps regarding restaurant information, store information, and so on. Google does this by intention, okay? And Google also says for some others, I'm going to do that by myself. For example, for road information, or for those photos of the house, road, whatever, Google does it by themselves. However, for restaurant and store information, Google allows everybody to do that. So for different issues, different information, Google choose different ways. Again, that will be some topics that we will talk about when we have the issue regarding platform governance. Okay, let's wait for that. Microsoft is also doing a lot of things. And as we mentioned about iOS and Android, because there are software issues, there are apps in app stores. So you may also consider Windows as a multi-sided platform because it's an operating system where you may still install software provided by some software vendors, not Microsoft. You may also think about, for example, Xbox. Well, for Xbox, basically that's also a multi-sided platform. Why is that? Because on Xbox, if you are consumers, you also see those software providers or game developers, all right? You still purchase from game developers. And what's even more important is that it's highly possible for a manufacturer of Xbox to give some discounts to consumers, right? Because if you make the machine cheaper, there will be more and more consumers purchasing your machine. In some sense, they join the platform. And once they do that, basically it will be more and more easier for game developers to sell their games to consumers. Your Xbox becomes a more important channel for these game developers. Then it's easier for you to get some revenue sharing or authorization fees from those game developers. That's pretty much the same as, for example, coffee machines, okay? So on Xbox, Microsoft is playing platform strategies. Again, Microsoft can actually say, well, I don't care about game developers. I will only sell Xbox as my major revenue source. I don't try to get revenue from game developers. I simply make the Xbox expensive enough. But Microsoft believes this is not the best way. Finding some game developers to do some kind of cross-subsidization is more profitable, believed by Microsoft. Okay, that's again platform strategies. The next one, Amazon. Everybody knows Amazon. Amazon on its website You may purchase from Amazon. That's a merchant model. You may also purchase from third-party sellers. That's a multi-sided platforms. You may also think about Kindle. So Kindle is a very famous e-reader. Or I should say e-book reader. But anyway, the idea is similar to Microsoft Xbox. If you are selling Kindle, it makes sense for you to intentionally make it cheaper so that later you may earn more profit by getting some kind of revenues from those book developers or authors or publishers. Okay, so that's the similar idea. Facebook. So we all agree that on Facebook, there are consumers like all of us, and there can be advertisers, game developers, fan page owners, and so on and so on. They go on to Facebook to get connected to consumers. Facebook is a good example showing us that it's hard for us to find very successful single-sided platforms. Most of the famous platforms we observe in practice are multi-sided platforms. I don't say we don't have single-sided platforms, but for most major important platforms, they are multi-sided. Why is that? If just like Facebook, originally that's just a single-sided platforms, right? If you have a single-sided platform and gradually nobody wants to use it, it is dead and we don't know it. If you do have a lot of users, then eventually there will be one day some people wants to come at the other side so that they may get connected to consumers to do some business. Your platform naturally becomes a multi-sided platforms. So in short, if you are running a very successful single-sided platform, typically it will gradually become a multi-sided one. That's something we may learn, we may observe from Facebook. So while the first 5 brands, they all share some kind of platform idea, not all companies are doing that actually. For example, Coca-Cola, basically a manufacturer, a brand, right? Disney, well, it owns IP, it owns theme parks, it makes movies. It's basically not a platform. Maybe some of you may think about Disney Plus. Well, Disney Plus is a place for you to enjoy some online video streaming service. But at least for today, on Disney Plus, basically Disney all own the contents. All the contents are produced by Disney. Disney simply create Disney Plus to get to consumers instead of selling them to Netflix or somewhere else. So for Disney, basically, you may consider Disney Plus as just one retail store owned by the manufacturer. Okay, just like Nike may create some self-owned retail stores or its own website to sell to consumers. In that case, even though that looks like a website, it's not a platform idea. Okay, Samsung, basically a manufacturer for semiconductor products, for smartphones, pretty much for the major business, it is not a platform, it's a merchant. LV, I'm not so familiar with LV, but I guess LV is also a manufacturer, a brand. McDonald's, basically restaurant owner or creating a brand, all right?